Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Part 4, The Starship, Chapter 24. On their second day without the symphony, Kirsten and August came upon a line of cars queued along the shoulder of the road. It was late morning and the heat was rising, a hush falling over the landscape. They had lost sight of the lake. The cars cast curved shadows. They had been cleaned out, no bones in back seats or abandoned belongings, which suggested someone lived near here and traveled this route. An hour later they reached a gas station, a low building, alone by the road, with a yellow seashell sign still standing, vehicles crowded and blocking one another at the pumps. One was the color of melted butter, black lettering on the side. A Chicago taxicab, Kirsten realized. Someone in the very final days had hailed one of the last taxis in the rioting city, negotiated a price, and fled north. 2 neat bullet holes in the driver's side door. A dog barked and they froze, their hands on their weapons. The man who came around the side of the building with the golden retriever was in his 50s or 60s, gray hair cut very short, and a stiff way of moving that suggested an old injury, a rifle held at his side. He had a complicated scar on his face. "Help you?" he asked. His tone wasn't unfriendly, and this was the pleasure of being alive in year 20, this calmer age. For the first 10 or 12 years after the collapse, he would have been much more likely to shoot them on sight. "Just passing through," Kirsten said. "We mean no harm. We're headed for the Museum of Civilization." "Headed where now?" "The Severn City Airport." August was silent beside her. He didn't like to speak to strangers. The man nodded. "Anyone still out there?" "We're hoping our friends are there." "You lose them?" "Yes," Kirsten said. "We lost them." August sighed. The absence of the symphony from this route had been obvious for some time. They'd passed over patches of soft earth with no tracks. No horse manure, no recent wheel ruts or footprints, no sign at all that the 20-odd people, 3 caravans, and 7 horses were ahead of them on this road. "Well," the man shook his head, "bad luck. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm Finn, by the way. I'm Kirsten. This is August." "That a violin case?" Finn asked. "Yes." "You run away from an orchestra?" "They ran away from us," Kirsten said quickly, because she saw the way August's fist clenched in his pocket. "You here alone?" "Of course not," Finn said, and Kirsten realized her error. Even in this calmer era, who would admit to being outnumbered? His gaze rested on Kirsten's knives. She was finding it difficult not to stare at the scar on the side of his face. Hard to tell at this distance, but it seemed like a deliberate pattern. "But, this isn't a town." "No, I couldn't call it that. Sorry, just curious. We don't come across too many like you." "Like me?" "Living outside of town," Kirsten said. "Oh, well, it's quiet out here. This place you mentioned," he said, "this museum, you know anything about it?" "Not really," Kirsten said, "but our friends were going there." "I heard it's supposed to be the place where artifacts from the old world are preserved," August said. The man laughed, a sound like a bark. His dog looked up at him with an expression of concern. "Artifacts from the old world," he said. "Here's the thing, kids. The entire world is a place where artifacts from the old world are preserved. When was the last time you saw a new car?" They glanced at one another. "Well, anyway," Finn said, "there's a pump behind the building if you'd like to fill your water bottles." They thanked him and followed him back. Behind the gas station were 2 small children, red-headed twins of 8 or 9 years old, and indeterminate gender, peeling potatoes. They were barefoot, but their clothes were clean and their hair neatly trimmed, and they stared at the strangers as they approached. Kirsten found herself wondering, as she always did when she saw children, if it was better or worse to have never known any world except the one after the Georgia flu. Finn pointed to a hand pump on a pedestal in the dirt. "We've met," Kirsten said, "haven't we? Weren't you in St. Deborah by the water 2 years ago? I remember little twins with red hair following me around town when I went out for a walk." Finn tensed, and she saw the twitch of his arm that he was on the point of raising his rifle. "Did the prophet send you?" "What? No, it's nothing like that. We've only passed through that town." "We got out as fast as we could," August said. "We're with the traveling symphony." Finn smiled. "Well, that explains the violin," he said. "I remember the symphony all right." He relaxed his grip on the rifle. The moment passed. "Can't say I was ever much for Shakespeare, but that was the best music I'd heard in years." Thank you, August said. You leave town after the prophet took over? Kirsten asked. August was working the pump while Kirsten held their bottles under the spout, cool water splashing her hands. Craziest damn people I ever met in my life, he said. Dangerous as hell. A few of us took our kids and fled. Did you know Charlie and Jeremy? Kirsten recapped the bottles and put them away in her knapsack in August's bag. Musicians, weren't they? She was black, he was Asian? Yes. Not well. I knew them to say hello. They left with their baby a few days before I did. You know where they went? No idea. Can you tell us what's down the road? Nothing, for miles. A couple of abandoned towns, no one there anymore as far as I know. After that, just Severn City and the lake. Have you been there? They were walking back to the road. Kirsten glanced at the side of the man's face, and the scar snapped into focus. A lowercase T with an extra line, the symbol she'd seen spray-painted on buildings in St. Deborah by the water. Severn City? Not since the collapse. What's it like? Kirsten asked, living out here, outside of a town. Quiet, Finn shrugged. I wouldn't have risked it 8 or 10 years ago, but except for the prophet, it's been very quiet. It's been a very quiet decade. He hesitated. Look, I wasn't quite straight with you. I know the place we're talking about, the museum. Supposed to be a fair number of people there. You weren't tempted to go there yourself when you left St. Deborah? The prophet's supposedly from there, he said. Those people at the airport. What if they're the prophet's people? Kirsten and August walked mostly in silence. A deer crossed the road ahead and paused to look at them before it vanished into the trees. The beauty of this world where almost everyone was gone. If hell is other people, what is a world with almost no people in it? Perhaps soon humanity would simply flicker out, but Kirsten found this thought more peaceful than sad. So many species had appeared and later vanished from this earth. What was one more? How many people were even left now? His scar, August said. I know. That's where and where's the symphony? Why would they change the route? August didn't answer. There were a dozen reasons why the symphony might have deviated from the planned route. They were threatened in some way and decided to take a less direct path. They decided upon closer consideration that another route was quicker and expected Kirsten and August to meet them at the airport. They took a wrong turn and vanished into the landscape. August found a driveway in the early afternoon. They'd been resting in the shade when he rose and walked across the road. Kirsten had noticed the stand of young trees there, but had been too tired and heat-stunned to consider what it might mean. August dropped to one knee to prod at the ground. Gravel, he said. It was a driveway so overgrown that it had nearly disappeared. The forest opened into a clearing with a 2-story house, 2 rusted-out cars, and a pickup truck slumped on the remains of their tires. They remained a while at the edge of the trees, watching, but detected no movement. The front door was locked, an unusual detail. They circled the house, but the back door was locked too. Kirsten picked the lock. It was obvious from the moment they stepped into the living room that no one else had been there. Throw pillows were arranged neatly on the sofa. A remote control lay on the coffee table, blurred by dust. They looked at one another with eyebrows identically raised over the rags they had tied over their faces. They hadn't come across an untouched house in years. In the kitchen, Kirsten ran her finger over a row of plates in the dish rack and took a few forks for later use. Upstairs, there was a room that had once belonged to a child. The child in question was still present, a husk in the bed. Kirsten pulled a quilt over its head while August was still going through the downstairs bathroom, and there was a framed photograph on the wall of a boy with his parents, all of them beaming and resplendent with life, the boy in a Little League uniform and his parents kneeling on either side. She heard August's footsteps behind her. "Look what I found," he said. He'd found a metal Starship Enterprise. He held it up in the sunlight, a gleaming thing the size of a dragonfly. That was when Kirsten noticed the poster of the solar system over the bed, Earth, a small blue dot near the sun. The boy had loved both baseball and space. "We should keep moving," Kirsten said after a moment. August's gaze had fallen to the bed. She left the room first so he could say one of his prayers, although she wasn't actually sure if prayer was the right word for it. When he murmured over the dead, he seemed to be talking only to them. "I hope it was peaceful at the end," she'd heard him say. Or, "You have a really nice house. I'm sorry for taking your boots." Or, "Wherever you are, I hope your family's there too." To the child in the bed, he spoke so quietly that Kirsten couldn't hear. The only words she caught were, "up in the stars," and she moved quickly onto the master bedroom so that he wouldn't catch her eavesdropping. But she saw that August had been there already. The boy's parents had died in their bed, and a cloud of dust hung in the air above them from when August had pulled up the blankets to cover their faces. In the ensuite bathroom, Kirsten closed her eyes for just a second as she flipped the light switch. Naturally, nothing happened, but as always in these moments, she found herself straining to remember what it had been like when this motion had worked. Walk into a room, flip a switch, and the room floods with light. The trouble was, she wasn't sure if she remembered or only imagined remembering this. She ran her fingertips over a blue and white china box on the bathroom counter, admired the rows of Q-tips inside before she pocketed them. They looked useful for cleaning ears and musical instruments. Kirsten looked up and met her own gaze in the mirror. She needed a haircut. She smiled, then adjusted her smile to lessen the obviousness of her most recently missing tooth. She opened a cabinet and stared at a stack of clean towels. The one on top was blue with yellow ducks on it and had a hood sewn into a corner. Why hadn't the parents taken the boy into their bed if they'd all been sick together? Perhaps the parents had died first. She didn't want to think about it. The door to the spare bedroom had been closed, the window open a crack so the carpet was ruined, but the clothes in the closet had escaped the smell of death. She found a dress she liked, soft blue silk with pockets, and changed into it while August was still in the boy's bedroom. There was also a wedding gown and a black suit. She took these for costumes. What the symphony was doing, what they were always doing, was trying to cast a spell. The costuming helped. The lives they brushed up against were work-worn and difficult. People who spent all their time engaged in the tasks of survival. A few of the actors thought Shakespeare would be more relatable if they dressed in the same patched and faded clothing their audience wore, but Kirsten thought it meant something to see Titiana in a gown, Hamlet in a shirt and tie. The tuba agreed with her. "The thing with the New World," the tuba had said once, is it's just horrifically short on elegance. He knew something about elegance. He had played in a military orchestra with a conductor before the collapse. He talked sometimes about the military balls. Where was he? Don't think of the symphony. Don't think of the symphony. Where there is only here, she told herself. There is only this house. "Nice dress," August said when she found him downstairs in the living room. The old one smelled like smoke and fish guts. "I found a couple suitcases in the basement," he said. They left with a suitcase each, towels and clothing, and a stack of magazines that Kirsten wanted to go through later, an unopened box of salt from the kitchen, and various other items that they thought they might use. But first, Kirsten lingered for a few minutes in the living room and scanning the bookshelves while August searched for a TV guide or poetry. "You're looking for something in particular?" he asked, after he'd given up the search. She could see he was thinking of taking the remote. He'd been holding it and idly pressing all the buttons. Dr. 11, obviously, but I'd settle for Dear V. The latter was a book she'd somehow misplaced on the road 2 or 3 years ago, and she'd been trying ever since to find a replacement. The book had belonged to her mother, purchased just before the end of everything. Dear V, an unauthorized portrait of Arthur Leander. White text across the top proclaimed the book's status as a #1 bestseller. The cover photo was black and white, Arthur looking over his shoulder as he got into a car. The look on his face could have meant anything. A little haunted, perhaps, but it was equally possible that someone had just called his name and he was turning to look at him or her. The book was comprised entirely of letters written to a friend, the anonymous V. When Kirsten had left Toronto with her brother, he told her she could bring one book in her backpack, just one, so she'd taken Dear V, because her mother had told her she wasn't allowed to read it. Her brother had raised an eyebrow, but made no remark.